We have breaking news, everyone, as Judge Juan Merchan just ordered Donald Trump to appear for sentencing on January 10th. He can do it either in person or virtually. Joining us right now is MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin on the phone. Lisa, tell us what has just happened. I wonder if we just lost you. Hang on a second. Garrett, we have you. I understand you've just read in on this. Yep. January 10, that is 1 week from today. It is 10 days prior to inauguration. But give me a sense of what Judge Juan Merchan here in New York has suggested will happen on January 10.
Well, just reviewing this 18-page filing from Judge Merchan here, who was basically asked to answer the question of whether Donald Trump's winning the presidential election sort of provides him any additional immunity from prosecution or from sentencing in a case in which he was already convicted by a jury. Remember also over the summer, there was the question of the expanded idea of presidential immunity after the Supreme Court had ruled with a much more expansive view of what activities of a president would create some form of immunity. Judge Merchan goes through the facts of the case, his view of the arguments of both of these questions, and concludes that Donald Trump, as he exists right now, still a private citizen, is not immune from being sentenced in this case in New York City, for which he was already convicted. And as you just reported, Alex, orders him to appear either in person or virtually next Friday morning at 9:30 to be sentenced. He has to answer whether that appearance will be in person or virtually by the 5th. That's this Sunday. I'm out to the Trump transition team to see if they have any response to this. As you all and all of our viewers know, Trump has excoriated the prosecutor in Manhattan, the judge in this case. He believes this is a witch hunt. It has been, he believes, an unfair prosecution, something that he thinks needs to be cleared off his plate to best do his job as president. Clearly, Judge Merchan disagrees. But what form of sentencing, what might be appropriate here? I think our questions better suited for legal analysts, and there will be lots of time to discuss them over the next week, which will also involve Trump coming here to Washington to attend the state funeral for Jimmy Carter. So a very busy and complex week ahead for the president-elect.
Absolutely. We'll be asking questions of our legal analysts, very much so, to see what will happen. Again, we have the funeral, the official state funeral of President Jimmy Carter on the 9th. So the president will be in Washington. Former president and now president-elect Donald Trump will be there on Thursday the 9th. This will all go down on the 10th. We're all going to stay very closely attuned to see what happens there from Judge Juan Merchan. Garrett, thank you so much. It's been a busy day. We're grateful for you.
We do need to consider whether, if we're going to advance Mr. Trump's agenda, whether the current leadership is what we need.
I remain undecided, as do a number of my colleagues, because we solved so many of the failures last year.
I don't trust him that he's going to deliver. For the last year, he's been a speaker. Every time he folded to the swamp.
In the end, all that sound and fury from the so-called real conservatives vowing to push back against Speaker Mike Johnson's bid to keep control of the gavel, as per usual, signified nothing more than empty chest pounding. You had 7 of these real Republicans initially remaining silent when their names were called during today's House Speaker vote, only to go Johnson's way when their names were called again at the end. And while it seems that one of them, Florida Congressman Mike Waltz, Trump's nominee for National Security Advisor, might not have actually heard his name called the first time around, there were 3 Republicans who initially cast votes against Johnson: Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky, Ralph Norman of South Carolina, and Keith Self of Texas. And given Republicans' paper-thin majority, that was 2 more than Johnson could afford to lose. Perhaps that's why we saw Johnson walk Norman and Self off the floor to try and change their minds. And since he had previously claimed that he would not make any deals, no quid pro quos for him, Johnson went another route, getting Donald Trump on the phone to win them over. And lo and behold, they decided to change their votes, giving Johnson just enough votes to remain Speaker by a margin of 3 votes over Democrat Hakeem Jeffries. Of course, Trump had his own reasons for getting involved, given that had Republicans failed to elect a Speaker by Monday, the House would not have been able to certify his election on the traditional day. You might have heard of it, January 6th. Turns out the only Republican to follow through with his threat to vote against Johnson was this guy.
You can pull all my fingernails out. You can shove bamboo up in them. You can start cutting off my fingers. I am not voting for Mike Johnson tomorrow. And you can take that to the bank.
No torture necessary. Turns out all the tough talk from these other Republicans was just that. In the end, they did what President Elon told them to do. President-elect Trump told them to do. But the real moment of the day came after the initial roll call, when Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett, a non-voting delegate from the House from the U.S. Virgin Islands, rose to make a point.
I have a parliamentary inquiry. I note that the names of the representatives from the Americas Samoa, Guam, Northern Mariana, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and the District of Columbia were not called, representing collectively 4 million Americans.
The clerk offered this explanation for why those delegates were left out.
Delegates-elect and the resident commissioner-elect are not qualified to vote. Representatives-elect are the only individuals qualified to vote in the election of a speaker. As provided in Section 36 of the House Rules and Manual, the speaker is elected by a majority of the members-elect voting by surname.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This body and this nation has a territories and a colonies problem. What was supposed to be temporary has now effectively become permanent. We must do something about this problem.
I'm joined now by Democratic Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett of the U.S. Virgin Islands. And Congresswoman, I have to tell you, many of us rose to our feet when we heard that. And you made that point that I think a lot of people forget, that, you know, some 4 million Americans, overwhelmingly Americans of color, brown and black folk from Puerto Rico to the Northern Mariana Islands, and including the 700,000 some odd residents of Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, pay taxation without full representation. They can't have their representatives vote for speaker. Why did you feel moved to make that point today?
Thanks so much for having me, and thank you so much, Joy, for amplifying this issue for us. You know, we can't sit idle, and we can't be comfortable in the positions that we're in. While I have a vote in committee, a full vote in committee, I sit on the Ways and Means Committee, the most powerful committee in Congress. I can vote when we're in the Committee of the Whole. The fact that I could not vote for Speaker, and my children were there with me. Virgin Islanders were watching me and not hearing my name. And I had gone the day before to the election of Jennifer Gonzalez Colon, the new governor of Puerto Rico. And to know that we are people who represent the largest block in per capita of veterans, and still cannot vote for our commander-in-chief and do not have a vote for speaker, I just couldn't sit silent. I was sitting there. I was sitting next to Jonathan Jackson, the son of Jesse Jackson. He gave me a piece of paper as he saw me scribbling on the back of one and just put some notes. I've been working on this issue for many, many years about self-determination. And you know, Joy, that this has become a perpetual issue for people of the territories once we became brown people from the territories. In our country, so many states were at one point territories and eventually were allowed statehood. But in the cases that are called the insular cases at the turn of the 20th century, by the same justice who wrote Plessy v. Ferguson, he stated that the people who live in the territories are savage aliens who cannot understand Anglo-Saxon principles of law and therefore should not be given the full rights of American citizenship. Now, mind you, we have signed ourselves up to be part of the draft. And in fact, the people of the island that I live on, that my family is from, St. Croix, sent to this nation one of the children that we reared, Alexander Hamilton, to actually write the Constitution. And then to turn around and say that we can't understand principles of rule of law is just absolutely racism, and it's got to stop.
Yeah, I mean, we learned, I think a lot of people didn't understand. I mean, people from Puerto Rico get asked for their passports by sometimes TSA agents. They are not, but they can't vote for president unless they actually physically come to the mainland. I mean, it is absolute discrimination, and it is treating the territories as colonies. So I commend you for pointing it out. That there needs to be full enfranchisement.
You can move to Brussels, you can move to Paris, you can move to the Congo and just get an absentee ballot and vote for president. But if you, Joy Reid, or anyone in your family or anyone else move to a U.S. territory and resides there, then you give up your right to vote for president. It's got to end. And I want to thank Hakeem Jeffries I spoke with him beforehand and told him I was going to do it. And he was like, Stacey, speak for your people. So I want to thank my leader for being someone who's willing to do that and stand up for the rights of the 4 million people in the territories.
Indeed. And I want to end this segment just by playing a little bit of Hakeem Jeffries, because he gave, other than your comments, I think after that, the other amazing comments today really came from leader Hakeem Jeffries. Let me play that really quick.
House Democrats will fight hard to protect working class Americans and the things that matter to them, not the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected. Keep your hands off Social Security and Medicare.
And with that, I will thank Congresswoman Stacey Plaskett of the U.S. Virgin Islands, always representing. Thank you, good sister.
Thank you so much, and happy New Year's, my soror.
Thank you, soror. Much appreciated.
Congressman Jamie Raskin, who does know a thing or two about how messy it is a Democrat in Maryland. He was elected ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, and he joins me now. On the scale of possible drama, today was lower than it could have been. We could have had the first day of the last Congress with, 12 votes to get to McCarthy. What was your takeaway from today?
Yeah, well, I was sitting with a bunch of my colleagues, and I was with Jim Himes and Summer Lee and Richie Neal, and some people were predicting this was going to go on for a week like it did last time, and that undoubtedly is in the character of the ultra-MAGA, ultra-Trump faction as opposed to just the Trump subservient faction. But then others said, you know what, they're going to call Donald Trump, and they're going to get him on the phone, and he's going to talk to those people and tell them whatever they need to hear, and they'll convince Trump to damp down the chaos just on the theory that he needs to have the troops in order for Monday when he gets elected. Yeah. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened.
My read of the sort of main axis of division here is on this question of government spending cuts. And basically, here's my read, and I want to hear what you think of it, which is most Republicans don't actually care about spending. It's sort of a useful rhetorical tool, but actually it's not. It's who the government benefits, not how big it is, right? They like defense spending. They like all sorts of spending. There are some hardcore members who have genuine ideological commitments on the score. Chip Roy, right? And they're easy to roll because Donald Trump doesn't care. But this weird new question mark of Elon Musk suddenly gives that faction a level of heft and influence that seems to me like an unavoidable fight is going to happen on this question. What do you think?
Well, I think that's absolutely right. And it's gotten worse for them because the 220 to 215 margin just went down to 219 to 215. And then Elise Stefanik's going to go and Mike Walls is going to go. So you're talking about a situation where they cannot afford to lose even Chip Roy's vote. And he probably speaks for about a half a dozen members, maybe up to a dozen members, including Massey. And these are people who are treating Donald Trump like a complete lame duck. They know that he doesn't really pay attention to public policy. It's just a money-making operation for him and his family. And so they're already looking to these conflicts beyond Donald Trump. And they don't mind the idea of just, in a legislative sense, blowing the whole thing up. And that's why they've, tried to reserve as much as possible this motion to vacate the chair. They've designed it, by the way, in a completely unconstitutional way, saying that the majority, the Republicans, can bring a motion to vacate when the minority cannot do that, which is the first time, to my knowledge, that the rules of the House of Representatives encode partisan discrimination into how we proceed. Yeah.
Wait a second. The old for as long as you've been serving, the motion to vacate is just a thing available to members, not to the majority, the minority. And now they have encoded the power only for the majority into this new House rules package for the first time, as you understand it.
Yes, indeed. I think it's 7 members. It may be 9, but I think
it's 9.
You need 7 members or 9 members from the majority and not the minority. And I just
That's
find
wild.
no precedent for doing that. It would be like saying only, Republicans can move to adjourn or move to recommit or move to reconsider. It just makes no sense. It's the opposite of what a rule is. But, it's going to be a madcap ride with these people. I do think that we're going to be able to exploit these growing contradictions within the MAGA coalition, especially since Donald Trump cares less and less. So you've got, the inflamed nativist anti-immigration MAGA base versus the billionaire oligarchs like Elon Musk, who love cheap foreign labor and say, let's open the doors and bring everybody in. You've got people like Mike Johnson, the theocratic anti-choice right, who call abortion murder and have pushed for federal legislation banning abortion, like Johnson's Life Begins at Conception Act, versus those libertarian corporate CEOs whose employees are freaking out about all the anti-abortion laws that exist in half of the country. So you can see already things beginning to come apart at the seams for them.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't want to underestimate them because they did win the election and they do have the majority. So that's key. But the key thing here to me tactically is whether Democrats stay unified, because if they do and they negotiate through Hakeem Jeffries, the Democrats will have a ton of leverage. That's the big if. Congressman Jamie Raskin, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Donald Trump will face criminal sentencing in that New York trial where he was convicted. Judge Merchan ruled on that today. This is one of those days where we end the week and the new year. We knew Congress would be picking its speaker. We didn't know we would get this new decision, which tees up Donald Trump's sentencing, even without jail, for next Friday. I'm joined now by Che Coleman Dury. Che, welcome. It's not quite a full Che Day. Good to have you. As you know, Che Days have a logic all of their own. But it is going to lead to a Trump sentencing day. And I'm curious what you think about this development. I quoted the New York Times. For those who want all of one thing or the other, both sides would be disappointed. You don't get the ultimate reckoning of all the criminal cases that Trump faced. He ran out the clock on most of them. You don't get jail time. On the other hand, for those who say, well, none of this was real, it was all a witch hunt, nothing was proven, quite the opposite. Whether this generation or future generations care, this was a trial where he was convicted. He will be sentenced. As people know, there are many cases that don't always involve jail in the sentencing, but that is New York's resolution of this as a criminal matter.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a instinct, I think, on a lot of people, particularly a lot of Democrats, to say, okay, this is in the past. We should stop talking about it. We should never mention this again. I think that would be a terrible mistake. I think that we need to talk about this case, and we need to continue to talk about this case, and we need to talk about the fact that Donald Trump is a convicted felon. It is a matter of public record. It has occurred. It does not stop him from being inaugurated as president on January 20th. But it will certainly be part of the record of Donald Trump, and it should be part of the political argument against Donald Trump. I mean, part of the frustration I've had about this is Democrats never talked about this. They never wanted to discuss this. And the issue here wasn't necessarily Trump's criminality. It is Trump's hypocrisy. And we're going to see that in this administration. We're going to see an administration that is going to very much want to be in the bedrooms of Americans, that wants to control access to birth control, that wants to control access to reproductive rights. They want to get involved in your personal affairs. They're going to curb back LGBTQ rights. All of those things are going to happen in this presidency. Let's talk about what happens in Donald Trump's own personal life and Donald Trump's own bedroom. This is sheer hypocrisy. This is a Bible salesman. This is somebody who is the choice of Mike Johnson and the evangelical right, who has conducted himself in this manner that is both criminal and, by the tenets that he claims to uphold, deeply immoral. It's something that we should have talked about more, and it's something we still can talk about more.
Yeah, and it's interesting to hear you say that because Trump has had this journey and he returns to the White House, and we all know a lot of that. But, you know, Bill Clinton had 2 terms in the White House, and the Republican apparatus did not tire of efforts to use various legal processes. Some of them were fully lawful. Some of them may have actually skirted it, and everyone can debate what is politicized law or not. But they certainly never tired of saying, well, Whitewater didn't lead to anything, or bringing in aides to testify didn't lead to anything. We better just drop it, or this isn't, quote, working. And so it speaks to some sort of difference in the political energies or psychologies, in a way, that what you just described, again, I'm making a political observation mixed with the legal underpinning, but the legal part is done in this case. He was convicted. And it very well may be fair that he was convicted, which is how New York deals with this, but that he doesn't immediately go to jail because he's a first-time offender and these were business issues. But how do you see that contrast to the sort of relentless approach on the other side?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about what happened with Bill Clinton, I mean, the Republicans went relentlessly against him, and it very much hurt Al Gore. Al Gore was very much hurt by the sense that there were all these Clinton scandals and we needed to change and turn the page. And George W. Bush said, I'm going to restore honor and integrity to the Oval Office. You know, I remember Chris Matthews, who was on this network and once had the show that was after this, saying, you know, Bill Clinton took the bath and Al Gore got the bathroom ring, you know, and that was a result of a sustained Republican attack on those issues. And it did matter. It mattered very much when, you know, Bill Clinton's scandals, all of those things were attacked, and it caused a sense among the electorate that they have to turn the page. We just never really did that with Donald Trump, unfortunately.
Ron, in addition to NBC's reporting about the delays in implementing these state-of-the-art barriers, the New York Times is reporting today that New Orleans officials were warned way back in 2019 about the faulty bollards, which were under repair when this attack happened. What's your view of this barricade issue and why there wasn't a better contingency plan in place?
Well, it seems clear the city has not answered that question either. I mean, these types of reports indicate that this is a 4 or 5 year problem in the development. Having spent 25 years of my career in New Orleans and walking a beat on Bourbon Street, the police department can only operate with the equipment that it's given after it's asked for. So I think the city of New Orleans has some questions to answer for the public.
Why weren't those big, hard barriers up?
It's hard to know because nobody seems to be saying right now. The first press conference was difficult to understand some of the messaging that was going on. I think the continued questions of where were these, how were they paid for, when did they not work, when did they work, and why weren't they being used? The Super Bowl is a different SEER level response from the federal government. The Sugar Bowl is not quite as high as a response. Nonetheless, the public expects to be safe.
Frank, regarding the attacker's route during this specific attack, we know it started when he drove around a police car onto the sidewalk to enter Bourbon Street. Are there procedures in place to respond immediately in a scenario like this? And does it look like those types of procedures were implemented?
It's hard to tell right now. There needs to be a comprehensive, independent investigation, whether that's from the state authorities or whether they hire a reputable private firm to come in and do the after action. The people of the state need to reestablish their belief in the credibility of the department. And right now, I don't think that's there. So you can have protocols to do rapid response. There may be rapid response teams right there, likely were. The question is whether they implement the protocol. Having them in place and executing on the protocol are two different things. And I think some of the superintendents, the current superintendent's responses to, hey, we're not about fixing blame, and no, I didn't know we had these L-shaped Archer barriers. That's not good. It's not good. People need some answers. And I wanted, with all of this kind of analysis, I think it's really important to point out that the officers on the street, on the scene, that ran toward the gunshots, ran toward the problem, and then neutralized the suspect need to be awarded. That should not be lost. Their heroism should not be lost as we discuss and critique what happened.
That's a good point, and there were a lot of heroes that day. Could have been even worse, sadly. Frank, let's talk about the suspect and this attacker, I should say. We are learning more and more about his background. NBC News really paints a picture of someone who went from a model soldier to ISIS supporter. We know he did have marriage troubles. He had financial troubles. For investigators in the intel community, how important is it to determine the source of his radicalization, and how will that information be used?
We've got a homegrown violent extremism problem in the United States. So every one of these helps the intelligence and law enforcement community understand what's happening out there. There are some of the commonalities with him, and then there are some things that are different. Many people think once they hear, oh, 100% driven by ISIS motivation, they kind of say, okay, that's the end of the story. But the reality is that there's a lot more to every story of radicalization. It's not just becoming a true believer in a cause. If you're willing to martyr yourself for something, there's a whole lot of other things going on in your life. And you mentioned some of them. Pretty severe financial problems, 2 divorces, a restraining order. Even if you study the 9/11 hijackers, you see, yes, they were true believers, but why did they decide to really give up their lives? And you find bleak prospects in their future, no jobs in their future, economic issues. That's all a factor that helps the community understand how we might mitigate or prevent this moving forward.
Ron, here's what the younger brother of the attacker told our affiliate KPRC. Listen.
It's a complete curveball to, how I know him, and how I remember him. The way I know him is being kind, loving, caring, compassionate, charismatic, funny, smart. I understand, people want answers, but we're just as puzzled as the rest of the world.
Ron, someone who on the surface appears to be your usual upstanding citizen, described here as kind, loving, caring, but then behind the scenes becomes radicalized. How does law enforcement even pick up that scent? Can you keep someone like this from falling through the cracks?
Well, we see this happen in so many different types of crimes in America, and this one it's highlighted around the issue of ISIS, et cetera. When people make these decisions to harm others, there may be some clues. We've often learned of a term called leakage, where people will start messaging to friends, family, or others that they may be contemplating danger against themselves or others. Much of that's done at a level not in front of local law enforcement. When you think about the ubiquitousness of the dark web, of the internet, of social media, local law enforcement, and I was also a state police chief at one time, we have some resources and fusion centers which came after 9/11. But a lot of this internet diving to understand the difference between protected free speech and speech that intimates that someone is going to hurt themselves or other is what makes the difference for law enforcement at either federal, state, or local level to engage this person. And there's a lot of opportunity to engage them when they say or leak something that would indicate on any forum that they intend to hurt themselves or others.
And we're now learning that President Biden has decided to block Nippon Steel's $14.9 billion takeover bid of U.S. Steel, and he's doing so by citing national security concerns. That's according to the Washington Post, which reports that the White House is expected to announce Biden's decision as soon as today. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States said it was unable to reach a consensus on the risks of the Nippon Steel deal, leaving the final verdict with the White House. Late last year, NBC reported that Biden's opposition to the U.S. Steel takeover could test ties with Japan, which, of course, is a key American ally. However, Biden's reservations had bipartisan support. Last month, we reported that Trump was reportedly also planning to block the Japanese steel firm's bid. So far, Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel have vowed to pursue legal action against the government, claiming it failed to follow proper procedures during its consideration of the acquisition. This was sort of a political time bomb, Mike Barnicle, during the campaign. It seems, though, that President Biden has made his decision.
Jonathan, Gene and I were just talking about this off camera, this issue. And it seems from all the news reports, U.S. Steel keeps the name, U.S. Steel. That name can never go away. The other aspect of it is the union intervention, in this case, insisting that the deal not go through because it's being purchased by a Japanese company. And yet the oddity is that the Japanese are among our closest allies in terms of national security. I don't know what they would do to interfere with national security. But, Gene, the larger issue is the workers themselves. Exactly. Are there going to be layoffs under the new company, or are there going to be layoffs under the union? Someone has to figure this out.
Exactly. That's a really important piece of this puzzle, right? Because Nippon Steel was presumably willing to invest in the company. If if there were no problems with the company, we wouldn't be talking about a sale. So somebody's going to have to, ownership, U.S. ownership is going to have to step up to avoid layoffs. I understand the national security idea of having steel manufacturing owned by Americans in America. I understand that. But once you say, okay, that's what we want, it seems incumbent on government to help try to figure out, okay, who is that? Who's going to buy, if somebody needs to buy U.S. Steel, who's that going to be? You're going to get Elon to rummage through his couch and get the pocket change, in his couch.
Doesn't Elon Musk remind you of a Bond villain?
Oh, absolutely.
We will have more on this decision, perhaps with more 007 references, when Dom Chu of CNBC joins us in our fourth hour.
Brendan, let's start with you and Mike Johnson. This was obviously dramatic. It made a lot of headlines. But at the end of the day, Donald Trump has one priority: to be sworn in as the next president of the United States of America. Did anyone really think that there was a single Republican elected official that was going to stand in the way and block Mike Johnson and delay Donald Trump?
Yeah, there were enough Republicans who thought that they could maybe get some attention for themselves, maybe have a little weekend where they all keep everybody in session. But when there were only 3 people at the end of the day who voted against him, it was very clear, I guess, before they switched their votes, it was very clear that Mike Johnson was going to be Speaker of the House again. When Kevin McCarthy lost his vote, he lost 19 people, a lot more than a lot of folks expected. That number ultimately rose to 20. These folks were on an island very quickly, and there was intense pressure that was going to come down, not just on Donald Trump, but the rest of their colleagues on them. And the real question for them was, to what end are you doing this? What are you trying to get out of this? Mike Johnson basically said, I'm giving you nothing for this, which I credit him for. That was clearly the right move. The rest of them I think just wanted some attention. And when the rest of the conference and Donald Trump clearly want to start doing things, that's not going to go over very well. So they folded awfully quickly. I think it shows that these people are no longer just pushing around the speaker. They're no longer just pushing around Mike Johnson. When he's got Donald Trump behind him, that's a very different equation for a lot of these members. And they found that out very quickly. They couldn't even get through one vote before having to switch their votes and come around eventually.
He's got Donald Trump behind him today. How long will that last? If Donald Trump cannot get his agenda passed, is Mike Johnson just inextricably going to become his immediate fall guy?
I don't see why not. Because someone would have to be the fall guy, right? But what was so stunning to me about today was exactly what he was saying, was the fact that people fell in line so quickly. And there was all of this buildup, right? There were representatives tweeting things like, this is going to go to multiple votes. And then when it came their turn to vote, they voted for Johnson. It was just a
multiple
weird
votes. Yes, please, you're in. You betcha, sir. Yes.
And then a whole bunch of people who were just like, oh, I'm not going to vote. I'm going to wait till the end. Like, what is that? That's like just reality television behavior. Like, it's not real behavior.
No way. Reality television behavior? They'd be throwing down. They would go first. What's your take on how it happened?
Well, I think what is fascinating about this is how it ended up being so anticlimactic in terms of just being boring, regular politics. I mean, if you're a hillhead, there's stories about, blocking certain votes from happening so they could get off, into the cloakroom and make these phone calls and work it out. But if you're not that plugged in, it's like the Republicans nominated their Republican leader, made him the Speaker of the House, and moved on. And that, to me, is just such an interesting transition from what everybody has been thinking about with this last Congress and how crazy it was. This one, day one, pretty boring.
Okay, the last Congress and also the last Trump administration, right? I went into this morning thinking we had chaos in the first Trump administration. We're walking into chaos now. Except we didn't. One vote and he was in.
And not only that, the rules changed this evening so that one person cannot move to vacate the speakership. It's now 9.
Thank you, Matt Gaetz. Yes.
There for Well, and what's really going to be interesting stuff. It may not be chaotic now, but you have such a narrow majority, the narrowest majority since the Great Depression between House Democrats and Republicans, where after a couple of congressmen leave to join the Trump administration, it's going to be 217 to 215 until those folks are replaced. So maybe the chaos and the drama isn't today. It could still be forthcoming in a matter of weeks or months.
And that's exactly what I want to talk about. Brendan, the House Freedom Caucus wrote a letter saying they only voted for Johnson because of Trump's upcoming inauguration and agenda. And Johnson tweeted his commitments going forward, and in it includes working with Doge, right? That's Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, who want to cut $2 trillion out of the budget. Right? We know there isn't $2 trillion to cut, right? In theory, lots of us would agree, yes, way too much government spending. They've got to cut. But when you actually tick through where they can cut, we saw it 2 weeks ago when they were talking about the budget. Once you get down to it, those Congress people don't want to make these cuts because they cannot get reelected. Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk don't have to worry about that. They're private citizens who don't have to run for anything. So how is legislating actually going to work here?
Yeah, and this is the problem that Kevin McCarthy ran into. He gave people the impressions they were going to be able to do far deeper spending cuts than were practical. And Mike Johnson is going to run into the same problem that Kevin McCarthy did. You have to get things through the Senate. You can sit there in the House of Representatives and say you want to cut all day long, but that doesn't make law. And ultimately, if people are expecting you're going to cut $2 trillion, and that's just completely impractical, at some point the bill is going to come due. So you mentioned the Freedom Caucus, and the vote, the threshold to remove the speaker is now 9 members. Freedom Caucus puts out a letter shortly after this vote. There's 11 of them signing it. I don't think it was an accident that they were showing we have the numbers if we want to kick you out at some point. And it wouldn't surprise me if come March, for example, when they have to fund the government, the first opportunity to do anything fiscal, and they can't do much of anything to cut spending at all, that this is going to come right back around, and we're going to potentially see a motion to vacate. I think you're right. Donald Trump will only really tolerate him as long as he feels like he's moving his agenda. Donald Trump probably doesn't care a whole lot about cutting spending, frankly. But if there's a bunch of grumbling and unease from the members who are most aligned with him, I don't know how long we can be expected to have Donald Trump bailing out Mike Johnson over and over again.
Ron, you're my fiscal friend here. What's your take?
My fiscal friend.
Right,
I've never really been dubbed that before.
Right, there's all sorts of, for example, Wall Street guys who talk about entitlement reform and Social Security is going to run out, and it is. But when you want to go out and get reelected, senior citizens are going to say to you, like hell, you're going to touch that.
Well, there's an enormous math problem here. I mean, it's as simple as that.
And there has been for years.
I mean, so cutting $2 trillion, no, you can't do it because non-defense discretionary spending is about $900 billion to $1 trillion, and that's the only thing you can really cut, and that is every service program that exists in the United States. Then beyond that, economists, as you indicate, have pointed out also that Donald Trump's agenda, if fully enacted, would cost somewhere between $5 to $15 trillion in additional debt added to the national total of $36 trillion. So even if you cut $2 trillion over 10 years, you're still going to be adding to deficits and debt no matter what you do. So there is going to be some dynamic math tension going on in really just the next couple of weeks.
I think it's weird how fast Doge has taken over the conversation about the next Trump administration, right? This is a guy who was elected to do stuff about the border, to do all these deportations, to bring back jobs, to do all this sort of stuff. And then Elon Musk comes in and starts talking about this Doge stuff. And as you mentioned, everybody likes the idea of cutting things until the cutting actually happens. Then they get really pissed off about it. And then you have a situation where now this is a huge part of this agenda for this Congress now. I mean, that thing that Mike Johnson put out today, as you mentioned, it's all Doge, 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 Doge. This is not just a problem for Mike Johnson. This is a problem for Trump as well. They're going to steer this administration into a conversation about how much Social Security should we cut? Should we cut this out of the school budget? Should we cut this out of the defense budget? Should we cut this program? That's not where they want to be. Donald Trump wants to get rid of the debt ceiling, increase, and he wants to spend a ton of money on doing things he wants to do, like big deportation programs and things like that. I think it's really quite an interesting sideshow to this whole process, how big Doge has become and how much pressure is now on it. This is the kind of thing that could make an administration sort of stutter and stumble in its opening days, if you ask me.
But this is why you're seeing Steve Bannon come out and saying, like, I want to tax the wealthy. And this is my new agenda, the full populist agenda, because he talks explicitly about the fact that there was the killing of the healthcare executive. He thinks that's a huge thing for the American public. And he thinks that Donald Trump needs to respond to this. And I think you're going to see a huge clash right away between the traditional Republicans and then this sort of Steve Bannon pressure of cut.
Okay, but Donald Trump has spent the last 5 weeks in all, I'm not even saying this in a negative way, in all his glory, right? Like he is lathered up at Mar-a-Lago, right? His favorite place on earth in a 24-karat bathtub, surrounded by super wealthy people kissing his ring.
Yeah.
So there's no way, and even look at the people he's appointing, right? The number 2 guy in Treasury who's overseeing tax policy is a huge tax lobbyist who last worked for Microsoft and cruise lines, who knows full well how corporations can avoid paying taxes, but is not someone who's focused on the IRS collecting them. So that Steve Bannon agenda and that MAGA universe.
They just cut $25 billion from the IRS budget.
Yeah. But this is why we're saying today may have looked kind of calm and orderly, but that can't hold. It can't last because these factions exist.